Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly bariatric virtual support group. We have a phenomenal guest with us here. So we have Christina Hopkins. She is a practicum therapist at the Center for Weight and Eating Disorders who facilitate our pre-surgery psychological evaluation. So you may have seen her. You may have seen one of her colleagues as well. She is a fifth-year clinical psychology PhD student at Duke University. She's been working in the field of health psychology and weight since 2014, and her research focuses on the thoughts and feelings we have about our weight, our bodies, and our eating behaviors, something that I think really resonates with most people coming in to seek weight loss services. All right, excellent. So Christina, we're excited to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Colleen. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I do want to let everyone know that I won't be able to read your comments very quickly, but Colleen will share them with me once we get to the Q&A at the end. But if there's anything that I'm posting that strikes a chord with you and you want to share anything, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box. So today we're going to talk about quote unquote eating your feelings or emotional eating. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what is emotional eating, what is emotional eating not, what's a little bit of the science about how it could be related to bariatric surgery, and then we're going to spend the bulk of our time working through two different exercises that can be used as worksheets to get more insight about your behavior so that you can have the tools that you need to change your eating behavior if you want to. So that's where we're going. And then at the end, we'll open it up for hopefully a discussion about these things. So let's start with just the basics. Emotional eating is something that, people talk about a lot, but let's just get on the same page about what emotional eating is. So the simplest definition is just using food as a coping strategy. And when I say coping strategy, I mean usually using food to make some kind of unwanted situation go away. So that might mean making anxiety go away, making sadness go away, basically using food as a way to make something better, right? It can be as simple as using food as comfort or distraction. And it's associated with a couple of other things that are relevant to psychology. You don't need to worry about the jargon, but I thought this might be interesting to you if emotional eating is something that you struggle with. So emotional eating might be associated with something called alexithymia, which is just difficulty noticing and labeling your own emotional state. And also something called low interoceptive awareness. And interoceptive awareness is the sense of knowing what's going on in your body. Can you feel and identify cues from your body, like hunger cues, or can you notice your heart racing? All those messages that your body gives you, can you listen to what they're saying? So emotional eating might be associated with those two aspects of sort of not really identifying what's going on in your body or not having a name for it, not being able to pin it to an emotion. That will come into play when we get to the exercises. The simple definition, like I said, though, is just using food as a coping strategy, right? So what is it not? Emotional eating is not an eating disorder. It doesn't fall under the category of disordered eating. Sometimes people call it problematic eating or eating difficulties. And of course, there are people for whom, this is really a struggle, right? But what I don't want you to think is that if you eat in response to emotions, that you have an eating disorder, right? So we don't, it doesn't rise to that level. It's not something diagnosable in the DSM. Emotional eating is also not specific to one kind of food. You'll notice I have a salad at the bottom of the page, which maybe is not the first thing that you think of when you think of emotional eating. But emotional eating is really about what's the purpose of the food in this moment? How is this food functioning for me? If it's in response to an emotional state, that falls under the umbrella of emotional eating. It is more likely to involve those high fat, high sugar foods. And we won't get into all those details, but basically just that's because high fat and high sugar foods react differently in our body, and they are more likely to reduce physical and emotional pain. So they are usually the first thing that people grab, but it can be any kind of food. It's also not specific to one kind of emotion. People often associate emotional eating with just sadness, for example, but it can also be in response to anxiety or anger. Or it can even be if you feel really happy and excited, right? So just trying to remove some of those boxes around emotional eating. My next point is possibly controversial, but this is my own bias and my own training. Emotional eating is not always right or wrong or good or bad. It really depends on the context. It depends on what your goals are, what your values are. It's possible that every once in a while you eat in response to emotions and it doesn't cause a problem for you. It's also possible that it causes a huge problem and disrupts your life a lot. So it really varies person by person, which is why we'll get into those sort of exercises where you can tailor it for yourself. And then finally, emotional eating is not uncommon. It affects about 2/3 of folks in higher weight classes. And I would say it probably affects everyone to some degree. I've never met anyone, either in my clinical practice or in my real life, where people have not experienced some episode of eating in response to emotions. It's very normal, it's very common, and people just do it to different degrees. This is my sort of science nerd slide, so this might really interest you, or you might tune out of this slide, depending on what your interests are. But I wanted to give you a little background on just what the literature says, what the science says about emotional eating and bariatric surgery. So there's very mixed evidence about how it impacts our weight loss outcomes after bariatric surgery. But we do know that emotional eating is likely associated with increased caloric intake. So we would think that for some folks, it can get in the way of weight loss after weight loss surgery or lead to weight regain. The interesting thing, though, is that emotional eating might naturally reduce after surgery. There is a recent meta-analysis that I read that said they looked at studies that included like 6,000 or 7,000 people who've had bariatric surgery. And in those folks, they saw that emotional eating tended to go down on its own between 3 and 12 months after surgery. But in some of those studies, they also saw that emotional eating tick back up after that 18-month mark. So again, the evidence is kind of mixed. It seems individual, but there are some reasons to believe why we would think it could go down on its own after bariatric surgery. A couple interesting reasons why that might happen is after bariatric surgery, the parts of our brain, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm pointing to this reward circuit down in the bottom hand corner. After surgery, the part of our brain that is responsible for creating dopamine, which is like the pleasure chemical in our brain, that part, the VTA or the ventral tegmental area, it actually thinks that food is less important and less noticeable after bariatric surgery, especially palatable foods. So those like high fat, high sugar, like tasty foods. And it fires less dopamine in the brain. So that means that food has less of that rewarding property after bariatric surgery on average. We also know that bariatric surgery changes the level of hormones that are released by your stomach. So you might feel more full easily, get hungry less, which can lead to less emotional eating, or at least fewer calories in an episode of emotional eating. If anyone wants to know more about this stuff, I'm happy to talk about it, but didn't want to load it up too much with brain stuff. So the summary is, it's not good or bad, right? But it may not be workable for your current goals. So you have to really work on, well, what is emotional eating like in my life? Why do I do it? And am I cool with that, right? Here's some general kind of just some prompts to help you generate, like, why do I do it? before we move to the worksheets. First of all, our behavior is learned over time, right? So often when I'm working with someone in therapy, I want to know more about how they were taught to handle their emotions as a kid. Did you hear things like toughen up, or don't be so angry, that's not ladylike, or real men don't cry? Or were you told things that suggested to you your emotions were unwelcome? These are really common things, right? And so you probably did hear one or two things like this in your lifetime, or heard it through, popular media. Those all send messages that our emotions are meant to be suppressed rather than processed, which can sort of lock it away in a place where we don't really know what to do with it, right? And that could lead to emotional eating. The other thing I like to ask my patients is, how was food treated in your house when you were growing up? What was your understanding of the purpose of food? Was food just for nutrition, or was it also used to reward you for something? Was it used to soothe you if you felt unwell in some way? All of those things that we learn as a kid about how to handle emotions and what the purpose of food is are probably linked to what we now believe to be true about our emotions and what food's job is in our life. Of course, these habits are built over the course of our entire life, right? So we go out in the world, we behave certain ways, and our behavior is either rewarded or punished, right? And that kind of shapes us to behave in the way that feels most rewarding in life. So if you're constantly getting, dopamine bursts in your brain from, feeling sad, eating a scoop of ice cream, and then getting that dopamine, that's a very rewarding experience neurologically speaking. So that is sort of how habits get built over time. Of course, we have to think about social norms too. Cultural differences might be playing a role here too. Food is often used for social gathering purposes, nostalgia, celebration, and this is why I make the same Pitzel cookies every single Christmas, even though I don't even really like them anymore. It's really for a nostalgic purpose, right? Or the reason why we now get on Zoom with our family members for Passover and all eat the same matzo ball soup, even though we're not together, right? Food has so many roles in our lives that is more than just nutrition. So it's hard to disentangle like why I'm eating on a certain in a certain moment, right? And then finally, something I love to talk about is something called experiential avoidance. And this is a jargony term. This is like a psychologist thing where they like to make up words for phenomena. But so experiential avoidance is really just this concept that humans tend to avoid things that make us feel bad. Maybe that's a no-brainer to you. But the funny thing is, like, we do it even at the cost of things that are important to us. So I might feel a lot of anxiety, and so I might want to escape that anxiety by canceling a meeting or something. Even if that meeting was really important to me and important for my career, I might want to avoid that sense of anxiety so much that I would betray myself, betray my values to feel better. This is a really common experience. Literally everyone does it, even therapists, even me. So that's what we're going to talk about in these worksheets that I will go through. So like I said, food serves many functions, right? Serves many roles. So I'm going to teach you 2 ways to get more insight about the function of food for you on a given day. I'm going to teach you one simple way to do that, and then we're going to dig in to an even more detailed way to do that. And this will be something you can download from my website or screenshot if you are able to, so that you can do it on your own. So to understand any behavior, I like to think about the A, B, C's of a behavior. A stands for antecedent, or what came before. You can think of that as like the trigger for behavior. And then C stands for consequence, or what came after. B obviously stands for behavior. And in this case, we're talking about a single episode of emotional eating. So if you want to follow through with me and you've had an experience where you've eaten in response to emotions, even, sometime you felt sad or anxious or angry, and it reached for food to help you feel better. It works best if you think about a single episode rather than broadly, because it's just easier to generate the A's and the C's in that case. So let's say you're thinking about your last emotional eating episode, and you start to generate some possible antecedents or some possible triggers. So think about these prompting questions. Where were you physically? Maybe there's a particular location that always is associated with heightened emotions or emotional eating. Maybe that's your childhood home. Maybe that's a road that you drove on in a particular context. Maybe it's a place in your house that is associated with eating or emotional eating, like your couch or something. You can also ask yourself, what specific emotions was I feeling? There's a tendency to just want to say, well, I felt bad and I wanted to feel better. But try to peel away those layers of the onion and say, like, okay, what kind of bad was it this day, right? Was it sadness? Was it shame? Was I angry at myself? Did I feel guilt? Really label all the emotions that were showing up. You can also ask yourself, what did you see, smell, or hear? Maybe you drove by a billboard that had something tasty, and you were also feeling some road rage or something. And then you had an urge to cope with that road rage by, getting a burger or something like that. Maybe a smell was triggering, or maybe you heard something. Maybe someone said something to you that made you feel crappy, or so on and so forth. So really just sort of racking your brain like, okay, what are all the possible things that came before? Even things that don't feel relevant, and then try to put the pieces of like, how did that lead to that, right? And then on the other side of this is, well, what were the consequences? What did I immediately experience after? How did you feel after you ate, right? If you were feeling angry and then you ate, and then you had a sense of relief or feeling good, excuse me, that's a rewarding experience, right? If food always makes you feel better, you're going to reach for it over and over and over again. That's just the way we're wired. That's not a fault of you. It's just the way our brains work, right? Another consequence you can think of is, how did other people react to you? Sometimes food comes with social connection. When I was a kid, every time my mom and I had an argument, she would bring me ice cream in the middle of the night. And so not only did the ice cream make me feel better, but I had that sense of social connection with my mom, right? And so that is just as powerful as the food, is all the stuff that comes with it, right? So the consequences can give you a sense of, what is the power that the food has in this moment? Because if I realize that I'm using it to get social connection, well, I can get social connection other ways that are not related to food. So that starts to give you some insight about, all the meaning underneath this emotional eating episode to help you break the chain if you want to, right? So this is the very simple way of doing it. This is the ABC. The next slide I'm going to show you, we're going to slowly work through an even more zoomed in way of looking at it, even more detailed. So if this is your first time thinking about why you emotionally eat, or if you emotionally eat, you're going to want to start with this ABC, right? This is like the first layer. If you feel like you've got this ABC nailed and you want to move on even deeper, then you would go to the next exercise. So, how much time do I got? Okay, we're good. I love this exercise, and this is one that I'll link to so that you can download it if it's interesting to you. But I use this all the time with my patients. So here we're breaking down antecedents, which again are those triggers, into 3 different categories, into thoughts, emotions, and body sensations. So let's say I'm going through my day and I start to notice, oh, my heart's racing a little bit. My shoulders are tense, they're up here. My palms are sweaty a little bit. And then I start to notice like, ooh, also my thoughts are racing and I feel like I'm being really critical. Maybe I said something I regret and I'm having lots of thoughts about, why I said that or what people must be thinking about me. And then I start to label, oh, I think I'm feeling anxiety. I think that's the emotion here. And maybe it's also anger. Maybe I'm angry at myself. Now, for each of you, you might be more used to identifying one of these categories over the other. Like, I feel most equipped to notice my body sensations, but for you, you might notice your thoughts first, right? You might notice every time you have self-critical thoughts, that comes with anxiety and with a racing heart, right? So this portion, this top portion, is to get you to be even more detailed about the antecedents for you. And then we circle over to the behaviors that you do in response to these antecedents. So let's say, for example, that because I'm feeling like crap, my heart's racing, I'm angry at myself, I'm anxious, I feel like an idiot, right? Let's say then I go to reach for some soothing foods. I eat foods that overfill me, or I engage in some other behavior that's either numbing or distracting. So other common ones are, like smoking marijuana or reaching for alcohol, or even just like zoning out in front of the TV to like numb that sensation in your body, right? So these behaviors here are like a collection of things that you often do in response to these antecedents. Now, these behaviors come with short-term consequences. And when I say short-term, I mean like that instant. Like as soon as I have that first bite of whatever it is, let's say it's a burger, right? I start to notice a sense of relief. I start to notice that feeling like, oh, I escaped it. I'm now out of that dark place where I was feeling really self-critical and anxious. My heart was racing. Maybe my heart rate goes down. Maybe my thoughts are quieter and I feel distracted. Maybe there's other instantaneous consequences, like now I feel like I have a sense of agency, right? Often when we're feeling emotions, we feel trapped, we feel stuck, we feel like we don't have a choice. And so often our behaviors give us a sense of like, I'm in control, right? Which is really powerful and it shapes our behavior over time. So when you're doing this worksheet, think about like, okay, what's the purpose of these behaviors? What do they give me? Do they give me a sense of numbing, of agency, of escape? Do they make me feel excited or elated? Something like that. Things that happen right then, right? And then here's the tricky bit. These behaviors over here also come with long-term consequences, and those are usually a steeper cost. So first of all, this process is exhausting, right? Of like having all of this stuff in your body, feeling anxiety, yelling at yourself inside your brain, and then trying to make all that go away. That's a tiring process, especially over a lifetime, and people get worn out, right? The other thing is that these behaviors may be inconsistent with your values. It may not be how you want to treat your body or how you treat yourself when you're feeling anxious. It may be inconsistent with your goals, right? And so if you're working on reducing your portion sizes in preparation for bariatric surgery or avoiding high sugar foods so you don't feel unwell, then these behaviors, even though they're serving some purpose, they're directly in contrast to what you're working on for the betterment of yourself, right? And then here's the best part, or the worst part actually, is that these behaviors are really just giving you more of the same junk that you're trying to get away from, right? The whole purpose of these behaviors here was to escape the anxiety. And it may work for a little while, maybe an hour, maybe the rest of that night. But I would bet you 9 times out of 10, or maybe even higher, it doesn't work in the long term. And that anxiety comes back, and now it comes with a side of shame or a side of guilt or some other emotional experience, or even more thoughts of regret that I, went off my meal plan or whatever it is, right? So we get stuck in this loop. And what my patients and I call it is the loop that traps, right? We have these behaviors and we end up going around and around and around. One of my patients calls this the Carousel of Doom because you feel stuck in these habitual behaviors because they work in the short term, but not in the long term to really get to the root of what's going on. And it's really hard to break that chain. I'm going to zoom through this part because, like I said, I want you to use those worksheets to really get to know your own behavior, right? But here are some places you can start. You have to build your own toolbox, and that takes a lot of practice. It takes trying out a lot of different strategies and seeing what works for you and your lifestyle. But some things you could try: if the root cause is anxiety, try some soothing activities like meditation or ice cold water on your face to give you that soothing body response, or breathing exercises. If you feel sad or stuck, you might want to be lifted up. You can try energizing activities. If you feel angry, there's usually other emotions underneath of that anger, like shame or guilt. So you kind of have to dig deeper to see what else might be going on that I need to process. If you have had an instance like this before, try what worked before, or try things that have worked for other people. So that's a great reason to show up to these support groups, engage with each other elsewhere, so you can see like what have others done when they've experienced emotional eating and what worked for them to break the chain, right? You might want to read more in a book about eating behavior more generally. One that I like is called The Diet Trap, because it has some emotional content in there too, which is really interesting. Or of course, talking with an expert, right? Like going to see a therapist in the Center for Weight and Eating Disorders like me, or working with a dietitian, or just talking with someone on your surgical team about what your experiences are like and figuring out how you can get someone in your corner to help you work through that stuff. If you go to my website, which the link is at the end, I uploaded this worksheet, the Loop the Traps worksheet, so that you can try it on your own over and over again if you like. I have one taped to my wall because I think it's the most helpful thing that we do in therapy. So if you want that, it is there for you. That's all I have. So I want to open it up to y'all to share more about your experiences. My website's at the bottom here, and as well as the website of the Center for Weight and Eating Disorders. Yeah, so shall we jump in?
Excellent. Thank you, Christina. Wonderful. So I did put into the chat, I found the worksheet from your website. I did link to that in the chat, so you can find that there for those of you who are interested. So Christina, we have some phenomenal discussion going on in the side Q&A box right now. So I have a few different questions for you, but let's start off with actually Kim and James are both mentioning that what they struggle with is really constant, almost hunger all the time. And whether or not that's head hunger or physical hunger, not really sure, but knowing that even if they're not hungry, having an urge to eat. How do you even, going back to those worksheets, to remind everybody, like, how do you even know if that's emotional eating?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that is definitely the first place to start. And I like that you already kind of mentioned, like, I don't know if it's head hunger or real, quote unquote, real hunger, right? One of my patients calls it tongue hungry. Like, I just kind of want something. Like, that's a different kind of hunger, right? And they all feel like hunger at the start. So what it takes for you to break it down even further is to do that ABC sheet and figure out, like, well, what came before and what came after. And that might help you figure out what the purpose of food was in that moment. The other thing I would encourage you to do is establish some kind of mindfulness practice, or just sort of drop in to that moment. The next time you notice, I'm hungry, I have the thought that I'm hungry, right? Put a little bit of a pause, maybe 5 minutes or so, between that thought and when you actually eat. And then do something called a body scan. So just start at, thinking about your body, like, okay, how do I know that I'm hungry? Well, I know that there's a tightness in my stomach, or an emptiness, or there's a growling sensation. Maybe I feel a little lightheaded, and maybe it's also been 6 hours since I last ate, right? Okay, that's probably physiological hunger. I'm probably physically hungry. But if it's a sensation of like, I'm just kind of bored right now, or I feel an urge to eat, but I'm not having any of those body cues of like stomach hunger. And if it's just like a thing on the tip of your tongue where you kind of just want something, maybe it's a craving, that's usually either emotional eating or a craving based eating, which, that line gets kind of blurry. It's not totally essential that you label it perfectly every time, right? You just have to know, like, am I eating because I'm hungry or am I eating because I'm not? And if not, what can I try to break this cycle, right? So if you've tried just doing other things to keep yourself occupied to target potential boredom, and that didn't work, that might tell you maybe there's something deeper here. Maybe this is an emotional experience that I'm not picking up on. Does that answer the question, you think?
That does answer the question, but I think something that had come up in the comments that I think is something that we hear about often in clinical practice, especially from a dietitian perspective, and James did just validate that, yes, you answered his question in the comments here. So what about like stress eating? Does that fall into that same category of emotional eating? We hear about, in the comments here, we're hearing a lot about like celebrating and associating happiness with eating.
Yes.
Are they all combined, or do you look at different emotions differently as stress, mourning, happiness and celebration? Do they have different approaches and how you would actually discuss that, or do they all get grouped together into these ABCs?
Yeah, so as a psychologist, I would group them all together. And I think that's why I wanted to give the caveat of emotional eating is not inherently good or bad, right? Like, I see celebratory eating as a sense of emotional eating. We're using food to foster an emotion, to put us deeper in a sense of happiness and connection. And that's a totally fine thing to do, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Unless it gets in the way of your goals, unless you're doing it too much and you're going out celebrating with food 7 nights a week, right? Then that might get in the way. So it's really about, with all emotions and all emotional eating, it's really about figuring out, like, is it a problem for you in your life and your goals? If so, then you can use the same ABC sheet or the same loop that traps to figure out, like, why am I doing this and how can I stop, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. So one last question that I'll leave you with, but I'm really interested to hear your feedback on this. So we might be diving a little bit into Dr. Kelly Allison's work here.
Oh.
So an anonymous attendee here had pointed out that during their psychological consultation, right, with one of our psychologists, really went in depth about the timing of the emotional eating, particularly later evening emotional eating. What does it matter what time of the day that you're having these emotional eating episodes? Is it, better to try and plan for them to be in the morning versus at night? Like, what does it even matter for the timing?
Yes, that's such a good question. And I think the answer is it depends, which I know is not an answer that people like. But it yes and no, because there is some evidence, as you know, from Dr. Kelly Allison, that if you eat outside of your awake window. So for most of us, we are awake during the day and asleep at night, unless you're a shift worker, right? If you eat outside of your waking window, there are different metabolic effects. So that can lead to weight gain. So it's kind of that same old, like Oprah's always said, don't eat after 9 p.m. There is some evidence to say food that you eat later is processed differently in the body. The other thing too with Kelly Allison's work about night eating, which is more related to like when you go to sleep at night, you eat a lot of your food at night, or you go to sleep and then wake up and eat during the night. We also see natural shifts over the course of the day that sort of map onto our circadian rhythm about that shift our mood and our cortisol, which is related to our stress. So people who eat during the night often also experience a dip in their mood around that time. So, it's hard to know without working with someone individually whether that is like emotional eating or just habitual, or, there's more food cues in their environment during certain periods of the day. But in general, it is sort of best Yeah, it's best to eat during the day, right? To have a consistent daytime meal schedule that's, prioritizing healthy foods, high protein. All of that is going to help you sort of keep your eating behavior like within your control, be able to make choices more easily rather than just going on autopilot, right? Which is all going to help you after bariatric surgery. So
Excellent. All right. So last question for you, official last question.
okay.
We're hearing a lot about almost self-driven tips of how to address this, or how to identify and address emotional eating and hunger cues. Right? When would someone want to contact a mental health care provider to help them with this?
Yeah.
Is there a certain threshold, or are we at the point where it's like everyone could really benefit from therapy?
So yeah, you're asking a psychologist that question. So
It's a little loaded.
it is
Purposely so.
loaded. I mean, I think everyone could benefit from therapy, right? But therapy costs money. There are wait lists. Not everyone has access to therapy. And so I know that, right? So some things you could try before seeking out help are really like digging deep on these kinds of worksheets or doing more research on YouTube, to think more about what other people have tried, and then using yourself as a laboratory, right? Do little behavioral experiments with yourself. If you try something and then you collect data about how it affected you and how it worked, that gives you a lot more insight about what you can try next time. And all of that will help you if you do then choose, like if you feel stuck in that process and you choose to reach out to a therapist, that's all going to be more grist for the mill, right? You can tell them everything you've tried and what worked and what didn't, and that's going to give you a great place to start. So I usually say, like, try a little bit on your own. Try reaching out to others, engaging your social network. But if you feel stuck and you're considering therapy, that's usually a sign that you would benefit. So there's definitely no shame in doing that. I'm a therapist. I think everyone should be in therapy.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Christina. We appreciate you being here with us today.